three giant lobsters continued to march up the sandy hill away from the Nile in the direction of the Albion Imperial Museum party, who stood shocked next to their roaring campfire. Just ahead of these oversized crustacea scrabbled four native Kairoan workers hired for labour and guard duties. Originally there had been 6 hired helpers. One now lay on the sand behind the armoured monsters hewn in 2. The whereabouts of the final Kairoan was unknown to the Doctor and his companions. It was possible he could be hiding somewhere out of sight, safe and sound for the moment. Unfortunately, it was just as likely he was the first to meet those creatures, and an untimely end, down by the water's edge. Even now, his body might be drifting downstream, yet another victim of whoever unleashed this horror. The 4 surviving Kairoan helpers reached the 2 trucks parked a little way down the slope from the Doctor, Romana, Lou, Nathan and Timmy. 2 of them immediately clambered into the cab of the first vehicle, while the other 2, not wishing to get caught up in a scramble to board it, raced round to fling themselves into the driver's compartment of the next truck.
Hey!
Timmy cried indignantly as he realised their intention. To the obvious delight and relief of the Kairoans on board, both trucks started first time, and together they lurched off across the sand, swerving to avoid the clacking enraged creatures of the deep. The drivers were successful in their manoeuvring and managed to reach the road unharmed. Here they turned sharply and raced off in the direction of Abydos.
Worthless, spineless scum!
Timmy cried furiously.
I should have known the natives would be useless in a pinch!
Romana frowned at the enraged Albion.
I'd say they showed exceptional good sense. Of all of us here, they were the first to find a way to safety.
The Doctor nodded in agreement.
They were wise indeed. Unfortunately, that has rather left us in the lurch.
As he said this, the lobsters turned away from the now empty road and returned their attention to the Time Lords and their Albion companions. They began once more to march in their direction. There was a thud, followed by a ping. Nathan had drawn his pistol and fired at the leading creature, but the needle-shaped projectile had merely ricocheted off its thick armoured carapace.
God damn it!
Timmy roared in frustration.
If you want something done properly...
He left the well-known saying unfinished and rushed over to the fire he had built. He grabbed the unlit end of one of the lengthy burning logs piled there, then turned to face the approaching enemy, blazing club raised over his head. The Doctor's eyes widened in horror, and he started to raise a photograph he was holding in his right hand. This was the item he had been studying with Romana in their tent before they were disturbed by this nightmarish aquatic threat.
No, wait!
He yelled at Timmy as the Albion security expert ran down the hill towards the nearest giant lobster. The creature brought its pincers together in front of it to form a barrier to the incoming attack. Undeterred, the hurtling Timmy Cowley swung the burning branch down upon those claws with all his might. There was a crack, followed instantly by a blinding, booming explosion. The Doctor shook his head and pulled himself up from where he lay in the sand. The rest of the party had also been knocked off their feet, but Romana, Lou and Nathan all showed signs of life. The campfire had been partially scattered by the force of the blast, but fortunately none of the burning logs were threatening their tents or equipment. The Doctor looked downhill towards the epicentre of this latest disaster. Fragments of the first giant lobster lay everywhere, a large chunk of the rear of its body roughly where it had been before, but blown a good few metres down the slope. The other 2 creatures had either been blown a little further away than that, or had backed off a short distance out of caution. In any event, they were still facing the party, and it did not look like their advance would be stayed for very long. About halfway between the exploded lobster and the campfire remnants lay the body of Timmy Cowley. The Doctor scrabbled over the 3 or 4 yards between himself and the unfortunate security expert. Timmy's clothing was tattered and burnt. Much of his skin showed scratches from flying shrapnel and further burns from the flaming eruption he had caused. His hair, at least as much as remained, was frizzed and shortened down to barely a fraction of an inch, extending from his central frond ridge. His right arm was missing from below the elbow. The mutilated Albion groaned and stirred a little. He was alive! The Doctor grabbed him beneath his armpits and dragged him back to the others, who had by now found their feet.
Quick!
The Doctor barked to Lou.
Find something to use as a tourniquet for Timmy's arm. He's alive for now, but won't remain that way for long unless we staunch that wound.
Lou started removing her own trouser belt for that very purpose. Romana grabbed the doctor's arm, spinning him towards her.
Doctor, what happened there? You knew something about it, didn't you? Before Timmy attacked.
The doctor nodded grimly. He saw the photograph he had been holding earlier lying on the ground, partially covered by a fragment of pincer. He picked it up, dusted it off, and showed it to Romana.
It's a photograph of a section of masonry from the supposed Anubis tomb entrance up on the hill there. I thought it was pictogram writing at first and could make no sense of it. I realized too late it was simply representational.
The pictogram image read from left to right and was separated into two halves. On the far left of the image was a pharaonic figure pointing to the right over the heads of some stylized shorter soldiers or slaves, each carrying a burning torch. Facing these minions of the king was the unmistakable image of an oversized lobster. On the right-hand half of the panel the image was repeated, only subtly altered. The pharaoh was facing away from his men and the creature, his head lowered, almost as if he were crying. The figures of his men all lay upon the ground. The lobster appeared to be missing the upper half of its body entirely, with flames or smoke puffing up in place of the missing parts of the beast.
I should have been quicker to see its significance.
The doctor muttered to himself reproachfully. Romana tapped him on the arm.
Beat yourself up later. There are things planning to do far worse than that right now.
She was right. The two remaining giant lobsters had resumed their march up the hill towards them. The doctor looked horrified, but thoughtful. He snapped his fingers.
Timmy had the right idea,
He exclaimed.
just poor execution. Throw the logs, like missiles, explode these foul things at a distance.
Nathan and Romana instantly understood the doctor's plan. They each grabbed a burning log, the doctor included, while Lou continued to care for the unconscious Timmy. With her own weakened arm, wizened since her encounter with the sarcophagus in the Albion Imperial Museum, Lou reasoned she was not in the best position for flinging large burning branches. Nathan pulled back his arm, holding a blazing log like a javelin, its flaming end dangerously close to his face. Then he launched it with all his might. His missile struck true, but merely impacted on the surface and bounced off, lacking the force necessary to fracture the carapace.
Darn it!
He yelled in frustration. Romana frowned.
We have the higher ground.
She said with a sudden joyous realization.
Let's use it.
She then threw her own log in a similar manner to Nathan, only this time upwards at an angle of about 30 degrees to the horizontal. It arced high into the air before plummeting down towards the approaching crustacea. It landed with considerable force, aided by gravity. Unfortunately, it hit the sand between the two surviving creatures.
An excellent idea, Romana.
The doctor said brightly, undeterred.
Let's keep at it, all of us, before they get too close, particularly to our fallen comrade.
So the doctor and Nathan joined Romana in using her technique to launch a barrage, branch after branch sailing through the air to come crashing down among their relentless attackers. There was another crack and boom, a double boom. Once again, the doctor, Romana, and Nathan had to pick themselves up off the floor. They'd been a little more prepared this time and had tried their best to keep as much distance as possible between themselves and the lobsters, even leading them away a little from the crouching Lou and prostrate Timmy. But they had not been fully prepared for the force of a double explosion. The creatures must have been standing too close together, the detonation of one triggering the same in the other. The two Time Lords and Nathan trudged back over to Lou and the fallen Timmy. As they arrived, Nathan snapped his fingers.
Darn it again!
He cried.
I could have used the Phoenix Bell.
The doctor chuckled and shook his head at the crumpled detective.
I think we did quite well on our own,
He said, smiling.
And besides, we don't even know if the Phoenix survived its encounter with Dr. Nugatti and his weird black-winged thing. Plus, even if it had survived, would you really want it in the middle of explosions like those?
Nathan nodded in reluctant agreement. Then his face hardened, and he pointed past the doctor towards the river.
I guess we missed one,
He said grimly. The doctor and Romana both turned to follow the detective's outstretched finger. In the pale moonlight, a disturbance could be seen in the water near the closest bank of the Nile. From the V-like ripples, it was clear something was heading their way. In a sudden eruption of water and spray, a shape leapt from the river to land on the sandy shore. Rivulets of water ran down the naked figure of the woman before them. This sight was simultaneously less shocking and more shocking than it might sound. The figure was clearly neither Albion, Gallifreyan, or human. It had no secondary sexual characteristics to speak of, its gender only really hinted at by a slight broadening of the hips and modest swellings at the chest. Indeed, its grey-green, shark-like skin was more like a skin-tight wetsuit in this regard. There was distinct webbing to both its hands and feet, though less pronounced than that of the odd creature they had encountered on the A-36 spacecraft. Like that creature, she was completely bald and lacked the central hair crest shared by all Albions and Chiroans. Unlike that smaller entity, accidental offspring of Nathan Ivon, she had no nose, merely two slits opening where one might be expected. She began to slink, cat-like, up the hill towards them.
Marina Delamere!
Nathan gasped, his mouth falling open. The doctor leaned towards him and said behind his hand,
"So, that's your type?"
Romana, standing to the doctor's other side, slapped his upper arm with the back of her hand. He rolled his eyes, but for the moment made no further comment. Instead, he shuffled over a bit, trying his best to obscure any view of the unconscious Timmy Cowley lying on the sand behind them. Romana guessed the doctor's intention and positioned herself shoulder to shoulder with him to aid in his living blind. It had been Timmy who had ejected the offspring of Nathan and Marina Delamere from the A-36 while on the edge of space, high over Cairo. Marina slunk to a halt 10 yards down the slope from the doctor and his friends.
Greetings, Albions, Time Lords.
She called out, a smile on her lips and a mischievous glint in her eyes.
Time Lords?
Nathan hissed at the doctor, turning to regard both of that race with puzzlement and some suspicion. The doctor patted the air next to him impatiently.
"I'll explain later,"
he hissed back. Then he pulled himself up to his full height.
"Greetings, Miss Delamere. Might I inquire as to why you launched that explosive attack on us?"
Marina looked aghast, although it did seem a little insincere.
Me? Why on earth would I want to attack you?
The doctor frowned and looked a little less sure of himself.
"Well, you know, devil of the sea,"
he said questioningly. Marina gave a musical chuckle.
I see my reputation precedes me. I also see you've had some experiences with my people before. I'd guess on Earth rather than here in the Epsilon Orion system. Of course, there are other avenues of information. Nathan, lovely to see you again. I thought we were going to keep us a secret.
The devil of the sea made this final remark with a slight raise of a hairless eyebrow, the tiniest, near invisible sign of reproach.
Sorry, dear,
Nathan said, almost without thinking. Then he pushed his hat further back on his head and put his hands on his hips, hardening his stance and his heart in expectation of trouble ahead. Marina giggled again.
If I'd wanted you dead, any or all of you, I've had plenty of opportunities, and doubtless will have countless more. I'm far more subtle and adept at such things than that parvenu Nugati. But never fear. I said I mean to help you, and I meant it. It is, after all, in my best interests. So it was Nugati who set these giant crustaceans on us?
Romana asked.
But how?
Marina nodded courteously to the Time Lord.
Ham-fisted though he may be, Dr. Nugati has powerful allies in the book. I doubt he, or any other lower dimensional being, is communicating with Iktultu Setesh directly. But something, or someone, some lower order being, or fragment of the Iktultu entity, is feeding him power over some aspects of the book. Nogad, Inar the Fetid, possibly even other devils of the sea. Just not me, of course. Somehow, he pulled yet more lower dimensional beings, these giant lobsters, from their native universe into this realm to do his bidding. From what I understand, he was not the first to do so. This location has a history of such incursions, I believe.
With this last statement, she nodded knowingly towards the doctor. Unconsciously, his hand went to the pocket where he had stuffed the photograph of the inscriptions he had been studying before.
"So you still want to help us?"
he asked, frowning. Marina leaned over, smiling mischievously, in a great pantomime of trying to look behind them.
Oh my, you needn't worry. I hold no ill will towards Mr. Cowley there, or you by association. To be fair, it looks like he suffered enough.
Nathan looked surprised.
But he killed our son.
Now Marina did appear to share his surprise a little, but at his attitude, it seemed, rather than his revelation.
Oh, dear Nathan. He appears to have upset you far more than me.
She began, her mischievous smile returning.
You must realize, I've had thousands, hundreds of thousands of children over the millennia, on countless worlds. Imagine if I felt anger each time one was eaten by a shark, or got caught in some fisherman's nets, or were swallowed by a kraken. Imagine if I sought vengeance upon every perpetrator, be it fish or foulness. I'll never get anything done. No, Nathan, my people view procreation somewhat differently than yours. Certainly I do. It's not the kill, it's the thrill of the chase.
Nathan lapsed into thoughtful silence. The doctor took up the pursuit.
"So, Miss Delamere, what did you wish to tell us?"
Marina giggled.
Straight back to the point, Doctor? But I suppose you're right. Time may be very short indeed for reality. So I shall be brief.
With this, her smile vanished. For the first time, the devil of the sea looked serious.
You must go into the Anubis tomb and prevent Nugati releasing Iktultu into our world.
Here she held up a finger to forestall the doctor's interruption.
I'll tell you how, at least as much as I can. Ultimately, you must enter a vast cavern at the deepest point of the tomb complex. There, Nugati is using the scarab amulet to open a rift to the book, one close enough to Iktultu Setesh to attract his attention, or simply accidentally draw him in, who can say? You must use the amulet to reverse this.
Here the doctor did butt in successfully.
"How?"
he asked simply.
Oh, I'm sure you'll work it out.
Marina responded coyly.
But before then, you'll have to find a safe way down. There will be extensions of Iktultu left to prevent your entry. Seek Anubis to find the way. He is powerful and terrible, and may capture and consume you.
The doctor frowned at Marina.
"That doesn't seem all that helpful, particularly the part about seeking out an entity who would like to eat us."
Marina Delamere shrugged.
It's all I can do.
She said lightly.
If Iktultu, or his more powerful servants or avatars, knew I was helping you, they would exert direct control over me and force me to destroy you. And I know I don't want that.
Then she turned and began to walk back down the hill towards the Nile. She looked back over her shoulder.
After all,
She cried cheerfully.
I'm having far too much fun, and I'd hate for it all to end.
With that, she reached the edge of the river and dived gracefully in. She made a couple of playful dolphin-like jumps from the water as she swam away at an impossible speed. Then, with a splash, she disappeared. Romana turned to the doctor.
So, it looks like we have a dinner appointment?
The doctor nodded grimly.
"One way or another. It would seem they are unavoidable these days."
He now turned to Lou, still kneeling beside the unfortunate Timmy.
"Lou, somebody needs to stay with him, make sure he's taken care of. Would you mind terribly if it were you?"
Professor Lou Halberd waggled her head noncommittally.
Hardly my preferred choice of activities. But I've started now, so I suppose I shall have to finish. I'll use the portable telecom unit and get more reliable help and backup. Hopefully I can persuade Percy Lambton to pull more strings with the military, or even come out himself.
The doctor nodded in agreement, then turned to Nathan Ivon.
I'm coming with you.
The detective said firmly before the doctor could open his mouth.
"You realize we're facing unimaginable horrors down there. It really might be better if you left things to Romana and myself.
Nathan shook his head with a wry smile.
Believe me, I've seen things you people wouldn't believe, and I've got a pretty good imagination. You're stuck with me to the end.
The doctor shrugged in acquiescence. The doctor, Romana, and Nathan each grabbed a lantern and a coil of rope from the supply tent. It was difficult to guess what else they might need, and so they hoped this would suffice, at least for the problems born of this world. Together they began to climb the shallow hill towards the main dig site. As they climbed, Romana and the doctor looked back at the prostrate Timmy Cowley, with Lou Halberd leaning over him, adding further bandages to his stump. The doctor leaned towards Romana.
I suppose Lou and Timmy weren't the worst travelling companions ever.
Romana shrugged.
Mostly harmless.
She agreed. As they approached the modest walls atop the hill, illuminated only by the moons, for there were two now in the sky, the stars, and their lamplight, they realized what was visible on the surface belied a far more grand entrance than they had expected. The remains of the walls were only a couple of feet high, but surrounded an opening 12 feet long by 8 feet wide. Within this lay a gentle cobbled ramp leading down. The previous expedition team had obviously made quite some headway in clearing out the entrance. With one final look round at the world above, they started down the ramp to whatever lay beneath. The ramp took them down in a dead straight line, heading away from the river and their camp, leading instead towards the naked, crouching, dog-headed yoga pose of the Anubis monument itself. Given the elevation of that construction and the steepness of the ramp, they knew they must be heading under it. At last they entered a sizable burial chamber with two stone sarcophagi on plinths dominating the centre of the room.
I remember reading in the notes Sir Arthur gave us that this was a false burial chamber.
Romana explained.
That both these coffins were empty, as were the two corridors to either side.
With this last statement, she gestured to the walls to the left and right of them, where two dark doorways could be seen. Doorways aside, the walls were covered in pictogram writing and illustrations, as was the wall ahead of them behind the coffins. Under other circumstances, this would have been an archaeological wonder worthy of study. As it was, they were on a different mission, with an unknown but pressing deadline. Nevertheless, Nathan took it upon himself to explore and strode into the right-hand door and vanished from view.
Nathan!
The doctor half hissed, half shouted in the direction of the disappearing detective. He took a step or two towards the door, then stopped as the private investigator reappeared.
Just a dead end,
He reported. The doctor raised his hands in exasperation.
Could we please all refrain from rushing off alone and half-cocked? I, for one, have no desire to be pulling anyone out of their dead end.
Nathan looked a little sheepish, while Romana tried to suppress a smirk.
Shall we?
The doctor asked with a withering stare, gesturing impatiently with a wave of his hand toward the left door. Together this time, the trio entered the unexplored corridor. The corridor led away immediately to the right, following the line of the wall through which they had just passed. Once more, the corridor walls were highly decorated, covered in the history and mythology of Cairo. After about 6 yards, the corridor turned abruptly right. To judge from how far they had come, this new section must have run behind both the false burial chamber and the dead-end tunnel Nathan had explored a minute earlier. The doctor stopped and studied the wall of this extension to the corridor they had entered. He frowned and held up a finger.
Observe, this wall is entirely unadorned, just blank plaster and stone. If I were a betting man, I'd say there was a hidden entrance behind this surface. Why waste decoration on something you're going to knock down?
Nathan coughed exaggeratedly. The doctor turned to see he was standing about 2 yards further down the corridor, looking at the doctor with raised eyebrows. His lantern was held aloft, its light falling on that same wall, or rather, where that same wall would have been if somebody had not blasted a 3-yard square hole in it. The doctor harumphed, somewhat flustered.
Yes, well, obviously I've won my bet. Clearly Nugatti has got further than any of us would have liked. Let's waste no more time here idly chatting the day away. Onwards!
Picking their way carefully over the scattered stonework littering the corridor in front of this rough opening, they made their way into the corridor beyond. After a couple of feet, this quickly became a staircase leading downward at a steeper angle than the ramp they'd used earlier. The walls were still decorated, but here there were more disturbing images and less actual writing. A worrying number of tendrils, or possibly serpents, appeared to be creeping into the imagery. The doctor paused before one carving on the stairway wall. From the inscription below, it was obviously a depiction of Setesh. The head of the being had never been clearly assigned to any one animal and was the subject of much debate among Albion academics and Chiroan clerics alike. Nevertheless, it was clearly not Chiroan. The body beneath was, however, and while semi-naked, was clothed in pharaonic garb. In contrast to other depictions Romana and the doctor had seen in their studies, this body had strange additions. Tentacles grew from its armpits and from its ribcage and groin, augmenting the more usual Albion limbs present. The doctor, Romana, and Nathan all exchanged worried glances before hurrying downwards. Finally, the stairs ended, leaving them in yet another modest chamber. It was roughly the same size as the false burial chamber they had seen above, but this time empty, and instead of 2 doors in the side walls, they had 3 spaced out in the wall ahead of them. On the lintels above each of them was carved a single name. At the far left, the ancient Chiroan pictograms, in which the Time Lords were becoming rapidly quite fluent, read Anubis. Above the central door was etched the name Setesh. The right-hand opening bore the moniker Osiris. The doctor strode towards the central door. Romana caught hold of his upper arm to detain him.
On the subject of rushing into places,
She began firmly.
shouldn't we check out the Anubis option? After all, that was the advice Marina de la Mer gave us.
The doctor frowned at her. While I appreciate your wisdom, I fear time is robbing us of options, and we have no idea if she really intended to help us at all. Romana waggled her head, clearly unconvinced, but offered no further objections. Together, the trio of travellers entered the Setesh opening. In spite of all 3 of their lanterns offering illumination ahead, the corridor beyond seemed unusually dark and forbidding, resistant to their light. After about only 10 yards, the doctor came to a halt, the others peering over his shoulders to see what was causing the hold-up. In the centre of the passageway ahead was a large statue reaching from the floor to the ceiling. 8 feet tall and utterly alien, its trunk-like body grew up from the paving stones before breaking out into a multitude of branches or perhaps tentacles. They contorted and reached upwards to touch the ceiling. They also coiled outwards and downwards, scraping the walls to either side and almost touching the floor. Each branch ended in a slightly broader paddle-like extension. Its colour, as much as their weakened lighting would reveal, appeared to be a sickly greenish brown. The statue seemed to exhaust the eyes if looked upon for too long.
Doctor, why is it?
Romana asked. The doctor stared the statue down grimly. I've seen its like before, he said soberly. It's not really a statue. I suspect it's an extrusion of Setesh or Icthultu himself into our 4-dimensional bubble of a universe. It is not the entity itself in a true or full sense, more a fragment or projection of its being. Nevertheless, we cannot afford to touch it. Romana nodded slowly.
I see. This must have been what you were looking for, but couldn't find under the Mondasian parliament when we checked up on Mondas. Perhaps we should try the Anubis route after all?
She suggested without triumphalism. The doctor indicated his agreement. Together they retreated to the chamber of the doorways, and this time entered the leftmost opening. This tunnel stretched out at 45 degrees to the central one, and they felt some relief knowing that with every step they were being taken further away from that accursed tentacled thing. After about 20 yards, they popped out into yet another chamber, this one perhaps half the size of the one they had left. Only this one was not empty. There were no other obvious exits to this room beyond the one they had entered by. Against the far wall, seated on an obsidian throne, was the figure of Anubis. So lifelike was his rendering of the god in stone, metal, glass, and ceramic that for a moment they all wondered if it might move. The doctor waved his hands at it as if to attract its attention. It did nothing and remained seated. If it had stood up, it would have been at least as tall as the doctor, with an Albion body in the garments of a pharaoh, topped by the tall-eared head and neck of a Chiroan hound. To be fair, with the ears it would have been taller than any of them. The doctor, Romana, and Nathan walked further into the temple-like chamber to more closely examine this hidden wonder of ancient Cairo.
Excuse me, can you help us?
This question came from Nathan and was directed at the statue. The doctor and Romana both turned to regard him skeptically. Nathan shrugged, unabashed.
Well, it was worth a try. I like to think I have some expertise in this area.
The two Time Lords both raised their eyebrows, but let the matter lie. The doctor scanned his torch up and down the statue, looking for clues. He suddenly stopped, just below the thing's knees. "Hello, I do believe I've found a riddle," he said, obviously pleased with himself.
This whole place is a riddle.
Romana said dismissively. The doctor huffed impatiently. No, look down here. On the throne, between its lower legs, it's a plaque with an inscription. Romana and Nathan followed the doctor's gaze and found the tablet and its writing.
Gee, I'm ashamed to admit it,
Nathan began awkwardly.
but I can't read Chiron at all, ancient or otherwise.
The doctor inclined his head graciously. "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" He read for the benefit of all. He was surprised and dismayed to hear the same sound emanating from both Romana and Nathan. He turned a withering look upon the pair of them. They were each standing with silly grins on their faces, holding up one hand each. Both of them were slapping the fingers of their hand against its own palm, giving faint pattering rounds of applause. "Oh," the doctor said wearily with a roll of his eyes. "I hope you're both very proud of yourselves. I suppose I should point out that technically that was the sound of two hands clapping, since you both made the same appalling joke at the same time. Perhaps that's why it didn't work." The sound started again. This time it was only Nathan. The doctor shook his head. "Well, at least I wasn't surprised or disappointed by who went ahead and did a solo. No, I don't think that's going to work. I think we're going to need a better answer to the Riddle of Anubys." The three stood around thinking for a minute or two. Then Romana snapped her fingers.
A bell!
She cried happily. Nathan instantly reached inside his trench coat, also pleased.
And I just happen to have one of those,
he proclaimed. The doctor clamped a hand on his arm, shaking his head again. "I don't think we should be using that bell. Not in here, and certainly not for this. Look!" The doctor's final word was issued more as a command than a request, and he used his other hand to shine his torch between Anubis's feet. There, resting on the plinth between the god's sandals, was a tiny ceramic bell. The doctor now released Nathan's arm and used that same hand to pick up the miniature instrument. He held it muted in his palm. "Should I?" he asked Romana and Nathan. Romana shrugged.
Why not? What have we got to lose?
The doctor waved his head a little. "Well, I could start a list," he began.
Oh, just ring it.
Romana cut in tetchily. The doctor obliged. A quiet tinkling sound rang out as he shook it, then died away. At first it seemed there was no other effect. Then they suddenly realized the room had just disappeared.
Doctor, what happened to the walls?
Romana cried, her voice sounding oddly muffled, as if the air had turned to cotton wool.
and the ceiling.
Nathan chipped in, similarly muted. "Never mind about all that," the doctor replied, with some anxiety creeping into his own muffled voice. "What about the floor?" They could still see Anubis seated before them on his throne, but where there had previously been walls, ceiling, and, of course, a floor, there was nothing but unending blackness. Although they could still feel support beneath their feet, as if the floor was still there, they felt just as sure that if they dropped anything it would fall forever. There was also something else wrong about the place. It was almost as if the air pressure had increased, or their eyes were becoming strained. They all felt migraines were coming on, their stomachs queasy on top of everything else. To the doctor's mind, it was as if space-time itself were upset, and he knew how it felt. The statue began to grow before them, Anubis and thrown together. Instead of growing upwards as one might expect, it grew mostly downwards, with the nose and mouth remaining roughly at their level. This only served to strengthen the impression that the floor was not really real. The statue grew to 100 times its original size, such that even with the snout staying at their level, the statue was forced to look down on them. With a rising horror, the doctor, Romana, and Nathan realized the statue had looked down on them. Anubis was alive! Still peering down at them past its own snout, the mouth began to open, wider and wider, exposing fangs which were taller than any one of them. They were to become doggy treats for Anubis.